You'd be shocked at the stuff that I pulled out of guns, pine needles and fern fronds and feathers and, all sorts of stuff.
We should be working on our shooting and our shotguns. We're going to talk guns today. At what point would somebody consider, I should send this in for a full strip and clean? What does that entail? And what should I be looking for to say, yeah, I might need this?
If all of a sudden you feel like the front trigger got significantly lighter or significantly heavier, little changes like that, we all kind of learn how our guns feel when we're using them. If you start opening and closing it and it's functioning, if the gun's clean, but yet there's some type of hitch in the giddy up or a gritty feeling or something like that, that's something you'd want to have checked out right away. And again, if there's a traumatic event, like you drop the gun or something falls on it, that's when you'd want to have the wood inspected to make sure there isn't some damage internally there.
Do you do more harm than good by, you hear people say, put a drop of oil on your stock and rub it in and gradually condition it over time? Is that something we should be thinking about? Can we do it successfully and not ruin the stock? How should we think about that?
This is a secret between you and me, Nick. The oils that we use on the stocks.
Hey everyone, Nick Larson here, host of the Birdshot Podcast, the show where we go beyond the flush to explore the full upland hunting experience with guests from all across the uplands, from shotguns to bird dogs to habitat and conservation, and the traditions that connect all of us to a life afield. The Birdshot Podcast is presented by Onyx Hunt and supported by folks just like you via our Patreon community. If you want to stay up to date and not miss any of our upcoming episodes, be sure to subscribe and follow the show in your podcast player, YouTube, wherever you're listening or watching today. Go ahead and tap that button. Thank you for doing so. And with that said, let's get into today's conversation on the Birdshot Podcast. All right, Del Whitman, welcome back to the Birdshot Podcast. Thanks for joining me today, buddy.
You bet. It's good to be here. This is our first video podcast, so
technically, yes. We did an Instagram live thing that was probably pandemic related. I recall that, which I then turned into a podcast. I checked quickly this morning. You haven't officially been on the Birdshot Podcast since 2022, which, it's hard to believe 3 years ago. Kind of crazy. I see you obviously multiple times every year at gun fittings and pheasant fests, and hopefully in the fall if our schedules align. And so it doesn't feel like it's been that long, but sure enough, it has. 2022.
There we go. It's good to be back.
Yeah, but you've been busy working on guns, fixing guns, making new stocks, doing gun fittings. What are you up to this time of year, Del? Just busy in the shop?
Yeah, busy in the shop. This is a time of year where, pretty much throughout the whole summer, I'm doing gun fittings right along pretty much every week, a couple at the shop, and then, of course, the traveling events, and just trying to work off some backlog. We're on the cusp right now of kind of the turn, that middle of July, people kind of realize that summer isn't going to last forever and start, going to the range a little bit more and thinking about bird season. So things tend to get a little bit more, the phone rings a little bit more this time of year. So
do your clientele, I always think of you're an upland bird hunter. This is the Birdshot Podcast. Obviously, I know you work with people from sort of all different areas of shooting and shotguns. Do you get an increase in sporting clay guns, that kind of stuff this time of year, or is that not really your area?
Oh yeah, there's kind of three setups that happen, pushes where people kind of switch over, and I start to, get a lot of calls and whatnot. And the first one is, the clays guys when spring hits, when the clays ranges open up and, the tournaments start and that type of stuff, and that's typically going to be April, end of March, April is when that happens. And then of course, August, obviously for the northern and the Midwestern hunters, that's really when everybody kind of kicks into gear for that. And then there's also, kind of another push around December, into January, and that's the southern guys, because although their seasons open up earlier, a lot of times, the Texas quail hunters and, that southwestern crew, they don't really get going because of the weather, typically until that December, January zone. So there's kind of that.
Yeah, I would say I've become, northern Minnesota hunter and resident we sort of live and die in the October, November timeframe. But through my work with Upland Gun Company and seeing where our busy season is, that really extends naturally for people in the South, that are December, January, February, it really bleeds over into other portions of the year when it's prime time, which kind of makes it fun because it sort of extends the prime time chatter and conversations for me when I'm talking to customers and interviewing guests and stuff. So I see that as well. Now, okay, we're going to talk guns today. I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping things. I just want to mention this out front. We do have a gun fitting coming up in August at Pineridge Grouse Camp. This would be for if you were ordering an Upland Gun Company gun, or if you just wanted to do a gun fitting, I think at this point, because we've got availability. So I'm going to mention that here. We'll maybe talk about it a little bit more at the end of the episode and have a link or at least contact info in the show notes of this episode. So just in case anybody's tuning in right off the bat and they are interested in that, we do have availability coming up in August. Is that correct, Del?
Yeah. Yep. That's going to be at Pineridge Grouse Camp. And, that's up by Reamer.
What are the dates on it again?
That's August. It's going to be 25th, 26th, and 27th. And we're scheduling 4 a day. And then, if we have overrun, we'll possibly schedule into the 28th. But that's the time frame now.
Cool. All right. We'll circle back and maybe share a few more details at the end of the episode, but just wanted to mention it out in front in case we lose anybody while we're talking dogs and shotguns and that sort of things. Now, did you go to the Great Northern this year? That's always a July shoot. Did I miss that? I feel like I didn't hear much on it this year.
No. And, I unfortunately wasn't able to go. I didn't go to the Great Northern side-by-side shoot in Medford, Wisconsin either. I was just, so busy, which is unfortunate because those are wonderful shoots, really laid back, nice shoots, but just didn't get a chance to go this year. So,
yeah. Any other events coming up for you this summer that you might be attending for business or pleasure?
Not really. We've kind of had some little family vacations. Really, my next big travel event is going to be that fitting series of fittings in August. So just kind of working with my new dog and trying to get as much work done as I can, and little gardening and some home projects and whatnot. So
yeah, oh man, we're gonna go to dogs, but now you open the door there. What are you foraging for, harvesting, cultivating? What's keeping you busy on the homestead?
This time of year I'm not really foraging for much. A little later we'll have some fall mushrooms that come out. We've got what we call king bolete here, spreading hedgehogs.
Those are mushrooms?
Yeah, those are fall mushrooms.
Okay.
Those are going to be a little bit later, but yeah, mainly, in my garden, I've had some pretty big gardens. I've kind of pulled it down in size over the years and really concentrated on the things that I use. So it's more of just a summer cooking garden. It's obviously got rhubarb in it, green beans, Napa cabbage, broccoli, the various tomatoes. I've got trellised, a couple different varieties of trellis cucumbers that I do. And then earlier this year, I grow garlic every year too. So I had a pretty decent harvest of garlic this year, but that's planted in the fall and then comes out, early in the summer. So,
man, I would have no idea. Gardening is not something that I could see myself doing it. I don't really have the space on my property. I feel like if I did, I would maybe be dabbling a little bit, but I kind of lean on you for some of that, and I look forward to hopefully some fall cooked meals. I can still remember the meal you cooked at Jeremy's camp last fall that had some sort of it was woodcock and wood duck, and what was the rice that you made?
Well,
Do you remember?
actually, yeah, was it the yellow rice?
You had, like everything, you had a little story to go along with it, and it was in your little cook kit. I can't remember specifically, but it was a hell of a side.
Yeah, we call that Maria rice because it's actually a couple friends of mine. Actually, he owns the gun store here in town. He and his wife are both from Brazil, and his wife's name is Maria, so it's a Brazilian rice, and it's a toast. You toast the rice in a little bit of oil, and then there's garlic and onion and kind of whatever you want to throw in it, a little chicken stock, and it cooks down. And there's something about toasting the rice and then having the garlic and the chicken stock. It's really a kind of a foolproof dish. Everybody seems to like it. But when we were at Jeremy's, Jeremy loves that curry, that green curry that I make. So I gotta make that every time I go see Jeremy. So
Yeah. Now I'm recalling the flying squirrel show that we
oh my
saw,
gosh, that was
and
amazing. I've never seen that many in one spot, and flying down out of the trees over the top of us. That was pretty cool.
yeah, yeah. I feel like I've seen them on my trail cams every once in a while. You get a fleeting shot of a flying squirrel, but I don't think I had ever. We were just for the listeners, we're sitting outside Jeremy's camp by the campfire, and he's got like corn or something out there, and sort of illuminated in his backyard. And these flying squirrels, I mean, there was, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of them, and they were just like climbing up and soaring down. It was a very entertaining show. Yeah, but if anybody finds themselves in a hunting camp with Del Whitman, they may be in store for a tasty meal. But all that aside, my friend, you got a new dog. You mentioned it. I want to hear about the dog a little bit, and something I do know that you did this summer, which was attend a Smith seminar. So before we go to shotguns, I'd like to hear about that a little bit. How'd the new dog come about?
I had been looking for, I had short hairs my whole life, and then kind of went through a phase and shifted out of them. I had some knee issues, and there was a point a while back where I didn't know, how well I was going to get around after some surgery. So anyway, and I'm fine now. I can go out and walk as far as I want to in a day, but I went from short hairs to an English Cocker, which I always wanted, and I've talked about Bill before. I love that dog, and I think I'll always have one of those in my arsenal. And then I had, I don't know, some type of midlife crisis and got a French Brittany. And Floyd's been an interesting dog, but anyway, I had those two, and I wanted to get another dog. I started going out west again a lot more, and just wanted a dog with a little bit more horsepower. And I'd always wanted English Pointer, and I had an opportunity to get one, and it was kind of a odd setup, but I was going to get a puppy out of a litter that two friends of mine were gonna breed, and just through some circumstance and this and that, the guy who had the female ended up wanting to sell her before he had the litter, and she was only just 2 years old. So he just kind of offered to sell me her instead of getting a puppy out of her. And it's been real fun. She's an LHU bred English Pointer, on both sides. And she's just a really sweet dog, got a lot of natural instinct. But in where she was at training wise was Cam, Cam who had her, he had collar conditioner. She's, pretty well gun broke, and he, basically just kind of, she's had that one puppy season under her belt where, you don't shoot birds that she bumps or flushes wild, but pretty much all the shackles are off, and so that's kind of where she's at. So, I basically got a 2-year-old dog that's gun broke, had birds shot over her, but she, doesn't have a recall, doesn't have a whoa, all those foundational things. And so that's kind of where she's at training wise. She's a great dog. I love that dog. The temperament of those LHUs is just really something. And again, my sample size is 1. So
Yeah, yeah.
I'm trying not to make, vague blanket statements, but kind of talking about the Huntsmith seminar, of course, a lot of my training originally that I used from the short hairs, or used for the short hairs, was based on all of Delmar Smith's stuff. And that was kind of my method, that, permutations of that. And I got exposed to a couple friends, my one real good friend, Brandon Smith, and a couple other guys, George Lyle, and they were all, pretty ardent Huntsmith guys, and just kind of seeing some of the techniques that they use. And, I've had some issues with my Brittany, kind of working through some things with him. And I kind of realized that there's aspects of that Huntsmith method that in retrospect would have really helped out a little bit with some of the issues I had with Floyd. And, I'm not being self-deprecating, but having had the same dogs, the same short hairs from the same breeder and the same line for so long, I kind of maybe overestimated my dog training skills a little bit, and I'm willing to say that they were,
Yeah.
I had it kind of figured out with those dogs in that system, and Floyd threw me some curveballs, and, again, looking at some of the techniques I was exposed to, I really thought, hey, this could be something that would be very useful, and kind of studied it a little bit and talked to, my friend Brandon quite a bit. He's helped me a lot, and of course Jerry has helped me a lot with Floyd too. But when I researched it, it's interesting. The thing that I realized about that huntsmith method of training is it's in application. It's very similar to a lot of the stuff I do with gun fitting and instinctive shooting instruction, where it's all very foundational. It's built on a series of steps where you're laying one little layer of foundation on top of another, and they end up equaling, you know, kind of the whole. I was thinking, an example of that is, something like, at the Huntsmith seminar, they talked about, doing yard work and steadiness work in the yard, and, little things like getting a dog to stand and be stable, on a chain gang, and, the thing that they said that really hit home to me was, if you can't get a dog to stand still on the chain or with a command lead, how are you going to expect that dog to stand still on point when you walk by it and flush the bird? And I kind of look at that like, when I run through a gun fitting or I'm doing instruction, one of the first things is proper stance to the target. And if you don't have that foundational piece in place, how do you do everything else downstream? Kind of falls apart. So it, kind of the theory behind it like that was, I found to be very similar. But yeah, it was a
Yeah.
great seminar. It was good to see Rick Smith. I believe that Rick said that was his last remote seminar that he was going to do. So it was kind of good to get in on that and see him and meet him. But
Yeah, a little piece of history there for you.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of things there that kind of got the wheels turning. I find that I feel that I could find myself in a very similar situation, in that obviously my sample size with bird dogs is pretty small. I've got 2 from the same breeder, and I feel very lucky to have found those dogs because, I've been able to kind of get away with some of my amateur training tendencies and have dogs that are resilient and really just have a lot of natural ability, which has allowed me to very gradually develop that and turn them into bird dogs that I enjoy hunting over. But that foundational stuff, again, it sounds so obvious, but I think it's sometimes it is easy to overlook, especially now we have so much information. Like, it's easy to go down a rabbit trail and sort of get pulled off in some direction and just totally miss the foundations. And I think that's one thing. I've never been to a Smith seminar, and I wouldn't even call myself a student of that method, but in the exposure that I've had to it, which is a lot because it's often referenced in the magazines I read, in the books, and specifically the book that our mutual friend Reed did for Orvis, Pointy Dogs, that's very much in that methodology. I felt like when I read that book, it was one of the few that I read that really gave you an idea of what we're after, the concept in general. Here's what we're trying to attain. And then, like you said, boiling it down to those simple foundational things that really are appealing because they're very easy to do. Like putting your dog on a chain gang consistently 5 minutes a day or whatever. I mean, those are very easy baby steps to take.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting too, because, going through again, that chain gang and the work with the, we call it we used to call it a wonder lead. I think they call it a command lead now, but, just
Yeah, pagan string or whatever. Yeah.
yep. It's like a little short, stiff lariat. And, again, without kind of deep diving into a lot of the concepts and methodology, again, doing that stuff is so important because it just, as you were just saying, it lays the groundwork for everything else that comes on top of it. And then you find, as you get downstream, and as I was referring to with my Brittany, there were things that, it's an example of what you just said. There were things that I had with the Brittany that I just missed. I didn't know that I had not laid the groundwork as well as I should have, and everything looked okay. And then later on, kind of in those finishing stages, some things popped up that were hard to deal with at that point. And yeah, I can't agree with the that sequential foundational application of those methods is really, I like that sort of thing,
Yeah.
and it also, when you're doing it like that, it really, I think a lot of the issues people have with, if they're training their dog, for the first time, or not real experience per se, is they don't know when to take that next step, right? And again, kind of that, am I ready to jump, to a wall post, and am I ready to jump from the wall post to putting a belly collar on, and when do I do this and that? And that system really kind of makes those choices for you, right? It dictates when you're ready to do. It's very clear when you're ready to take that next step. So
yeah.
And I like the idea of the silent part of it too. I really have over the years.
Talk about that a little bit.
Again, and I just want to say I am not an expert at this. I'm a novice at this. So if I get any of this wrong and my huntsmith friends want to crucify me, that's fine. But really what it is you're using a sequential setup of the chain gang, the command lead, and the wall post to get the dog to understand that these certain kinds of stimulation they can turn off and on by their actions. And so the chain gang and the yard work with the command lead gets them to have a response to stimulus on the neck, and then from there using the wall post gets them to stimulation on the flank and stopping with stimulation on the flank, and then you turn that stimulation on the flank with the wall post into stimulation with a collar on the flank, and then after they get finished, the collar goes up to the neck, and you can get them to respond with stimulation on the neck. And again, when we say stimulation with a collar, it's not a corrective type stimulation, it's a prompt. It's that little that little just tap on the shoulder. And
that's a good way to say it, prompt.
Yeah,
that's very timely.
Yep. And so yeah, it's that's kind of that transitional system where throughout those steps you're teaching the dog to always respond to a certain stimulus in a certain way, and maybe you're changing the form of the stimulus via the check cord, the flank pressure, the then stimulus with the collar, and then moving it up to the neck, and then when you're in the field, you're using the collar to prompt a stop or prompt a return. And in that method too, throughout that system, you're training the dog that if you stop, the dog will typically return. That's just kind of in there, part of that system.
Meaning recall. Like if you stop in the field, the dog sees you, it's going to recall. Interesting.
Yep. And then, you're teaching them, another kind of step to that is, doing yard work, loosening them up with a check cord, and they're out in front of you running, and you're changing direction at, say, different angles. So you're both moving, 45-degree right to left, and then you change directions and flip the check cord over their one side to the other, and then that prompts them to go in that direction. So you're kind of walking through the yard doing these zigzags, and the dog is getting used to that stimulation from the check cord, getting them to, they're learning to gauge where you're going and follow you. But then when you transition them eventually to the collar on the neck and you turn and they don't pick up on it, you can give them that slight prompt. They've associated it with the check cord work, and they should, change direction and, start to quarter in the direction that you're going. So,
yeah, that's cool. I feel like over the years, I would hear that silent command system, and like immediately your mind kind of goes to like some elaborate sort of hand gesture system, but it's really, it's more simple than that. It's like, it's doing those stimulus and using that to prompt the dog again to do certain things. And there's many, we're not going to talk about all the reasons why you would do that, because you and I are not experts in that. And it would be a different podcast entirely. But, like a low level stimulus on an e-collar or a prompt on a check cord or something, there's no emotion, there's no tone in that. Like there's so much less opportunity for the amateur handler to make a mistake, I think, if it's understood and done appropriately. So I'm definitely drawn to that, just acknowledging my sort of limitations and lack of experience.
Yeah. And again, I really, through having the cocker and, my short hairs were always in the classic, I prompted them with a whistle, for stop and return. But, when I got to working with my cocker and he was so responsive, I really found, especially out west, I, just as quiet as you can be, the better you are. And, when I'm, especially in the early season, when I'm out in North Dakota or South Dakota, when I'm running Bill, I'm prompting him with the vibrate on his collar. We get out of the truck. I don't talk to him. I don't whistle, none of that. The only noise should be the bird flushing and the gun going off, essentially. So
Yeah. That's a nice place to be if you can get there.
fingers crossed.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to leave the dogs entirely yet. When it comes to, and this stuff is kind of on my mind because I'm reading another book about training bird dogs that I'm hopeful to interview the author here pretty soon. And I would describe it as it's a how-to book, but I think it's one that I'll recommend. He's actually going to be potentially republishing it. I'll save the title and stuff for now, but I would describe it as a very foundational book. Like if somebody was looking for a book that they wanted to, there's a few that I would recommend. This, I think, is going to be one of them if they want to understand kind of what at least one person's vision is of what we're trying to get to, which I think many people would agree that's what we want. And the different levels of that, when it comes to steadiness, steady to wing, steady to shot, steady to fall, that sort of thing. That's all in there. But it's very detailed, but it's concise and it's to the point, and it's not a lot of tangents, not a lot of fluff, not a lot of crazy weird drills, that kind of stuff. It's just the specifics. A lot of stuff in there about pigeons, which brings me back to what I was going to ask you. I believe you keep pigeons. Do you frequently use pigeons in training? How are you thinking about that with the new pointer? Are you doing those kind of things?
Yep. I've had pigeons for 20 years. As soon as I moved out here and got my first short hairs in Michigan, I set my loft up, and the numbers fluctuate up and down depending on how much I let them breed and turn the lights off and on them. And right now I'm kind of ramping up because I will be doing a lot. I actually all my traps were either foot release or cord release, pull release on a cord, and I just bought a set of. I think it would be very tough to in an even remotely timely manner to train without, some type of controlled situation where you can do, bird exposures and have a lot of control over it. So, and I just like pigeons too. I like, we're kind of hobby farmers too. So we've got ducks and chickens and a million different pets, and I always like having the pigeons around. So
what kind of launchers did you get? New, used, marketplace? What'd you?
I just kind of bit the bullet and got some DT Systems launchers.
Okay.
That's what everybody I talked to, all the pros told me were the ones to go with.
Yeah.
So they're actually still in the box. I got to get them out and figure out how to operate them. So
I ask because that was one thing. I have one launcher that it's collecting dust. I got it. Some guy gave it to me. Reached out to me on Facebook. This is a long time ago. But launchers, the price tag will scare you. Like if you get your first bird dog and you look at remote launchers, I went down all these. It's like, man, okay, yeah, I see people using this stuff. I got to get these. You're kind of like, man, they're not cheap. I mean, they're just not something that you just buy willy nilly. But the benefit of them versus the foot trap and everything else. I mean, get by with what you got to get by with. But I think being able to pop the birds on with a button, it opens up so many more avenues for training and exercises and drills. I mean, coming from a guy that doesn't own launchers because I don't do a lot of that stuff, I think they would be well worth the investment. It's something that I would buy if I were doing more training. The reason I asked you that question is because in this book, the guy talks about the sort of the wild birds method. If you're fortunate enough to get your dog into enough wild birds, that's kind of like the number one. And then he sort of quickly implants the next best alternative, which is basically pigeons and launchers. And I feel I can get by enough on wild birds. There are certainly levels of polish and things that I don't do because I'm not doing the summer training stuff, which I would like to. And maybe now that my boys are getting older and I got a couple of extra hands, we could get into that as an activity. But I was just kind of curious how much you either have done or see yourself doing pigeons, launchers versus just taking this dog out and hunting, because you can get into birds as well.
Yeah, well, and there's a couple issues there, just the time restriction because it really narrows down if you're gonna train on wild birds only, um, there's the summer quiet seasons for ground nesting birds, so that cuts a big chunk out of it. Um, and for me, it's a level of control because, I look at it like, yeah, it's expensive, it's an investment, but what is your time worth? And there's that concept, and then one of the things that I've heard numerous trainers say is that level of control is so important because if you have one bad exposure at the wrong time and something goes wrong, and now you've kind of ingrained the opposite of what you want. How much longer does it take to train that back out of them and get them back, to where you needed them to be in that, and knowing that every time most of, making it more likely that in that controlled situation, I'm going to get the setup and the response that I want every time. Um, I think that's kind of the big benefit is that level of control.
Yeah. Yeah. Every time I have conversations about this, it just makes me wish I had like a 5-acre pasture that I could, if I had that with a little woodland edge and I could just walk out and do it, I would be doing it a lot more of it probably. But I guess point being, if you live in the city and you have urban bird dogs and you can't do it, it's not a requirement, but it is a nice layer for all the reasons you mentioned: quiet periods, timing, more frequent exposures. That's always better than, one weekend full of jam-packed full of stuff.
Yeah, and I'm really spoiled in the, facility situation because I've got a mowed front yard to do a big mowed front yard, and then, part of my property is kind of successional, a big piece of it, so we can do work in the woods, and then, if I walk 100 yards through the woods, to the east of my house, I've got a giant kind of derelict hayfield that's almost, yeah, it's almost it's darn near a section. It's a big chunk, and it's a friend of ours, and she, that's where my wife cross country skis. My daughter runs her four-wheeler out there, and it's basically just kind of rolling topography. So I've kind of got all of the various different cover types to work out here. One thing I'll say too about that Huntsmith seminar is, it was really, for me, it was important to go there because there were some really polished dogs and really top level professional trainers. And, I always find it helpful to, to really see what that end goal is and to see some professionals do it and kind of set that standard. The guy who had it, Jeff Martin, was there, and Joe Amon, who we both know, was there. And he's a,
Yep.
World-class trainer. My friend Brandon Smith, those guys, they're kind of the dog version of what I do with guns. It's like they're at that level where this is how I want my dogs to look when I get done. And maybe I don't ever get to that level of polish, but at least I know the ideal of what I'm kind of working towards. So
You've got exposure to it. Yeah.
yep, yep, yep. And just hearing Rick talk and, seeing how he was around dogs was very interesting. He,
Pretty cool, calm and collected.
yeah, yeah. And there's just you can tell when somebody's been there and done that, right? And he's been there and done that probably more than anybody alive, really. So
Cool. Well, I wasn't planning to spend a half hour talking about dogs, but hey, we're leading into hunting season, and dogs are important. They are a huge part of what drives us and why we do this. So when we're not training dogs, we should be working on our shooting and our shotguns. Let's go preseason checklist kind of stuff. What are you doing this time of year? I know you like to shoot clays. Obviously, that's maybe something that comes up naturally. Are you beyond the point of picking up a gun in your office and practice mounting, that kind of stuff? What do you do preseason wise?
well, our local range opens up, basically whenever the snow gets off the ground enough to open and the walkthrough course is open. They have 5-stand and skeet, American skeet, most of the year. But, usually in that middle of May, end of April, middle of May, it opens up, and, I try to go out and shoot a couple hundred rounds a week. They're open on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and it's you've shot that course. It's relatively the same, and it's kind of a tricky, close, fast technical course, and I love that. So, I definitely practice my gun mounts. I like to get out and shoot as much as I can, and everybody should. The walkthrough 5 stand is good. American Skeet is good, but those walkthrough courses really, you know, they help a lot.
Yeah, I'm trying to do a bit more gun mount practicing. Haven't shot a ton this summer. I likely will these next few weeks leading up to the season, but I try not to rule out, that gun mount thing. Like if you can't get to the clays range, you can do that, and that can. I feel like I've found that can pay dividends. Just that slow, controlled gun mount practice. Pick it up, do
Every
10
little
later
bit
in the day,
helps.
every day. Yeah,
Every little bit helps. And this time of year too, it's, the sooner you get your guns out in the spring or the early summer and make sure everything's clicking and ticking,
yeah.
this is the time if you're doing, patterning and all that type of stuff. You don't want to be rushing around doing that the week before opener. So I'm doing some, as I always do, I've always got to kind of work on a few new hunting loads, and there's a couple that I'm working on this year. So that's kind of, I'm starting to do that because I'd like to have those polished up and all checked out by fall. So
Is there, outside of normal gun maintenance, which we've talked about and we can talk about a little bit today, anything you're looking at for, like, with your favorite upland gun? Are we watching for anything, or just making sure, like you said, clicking and ticking and working smoothly?
yeah, just, take it out, function test it, give it a good thorough in-home clean, make sure everything's lubricated. Again, this is where you want to have a good look at the stock and make sure that there's not any cracks and, or things like that. And if anybody wants to listen back to our past podcasts, theoretically, you've got it on, somewhat of a maintenance schedule. So depending on the amount of use, every, anywhere from 2 to 4 years, you've had it in for a thorough disassembly and strip and clean and kind of a proactive inspection and thorough cleaning. Um, so that's kind of where you want to be this time of year, is kind of, you should have that pretty well all sorted out by now.
Let's walk through, not, doesn't have to be super detailed, but at what point would somebody consider, hey, I should send this in for a full strip and clean? What does that entail? And what should I be looking for to say, yeah, I might need this?
The full strip and clean, when I say that, what it is, the gun is completely disassembled into base parts, right down to the trigger mechanism. If it's a side lock or a box lock, all of the lock components, fire control mechanisms come out, the locking system comes out, the stock gets, it's a full disassembly. Then it gets ultrasonically cleaned, ultrasonically lubricated with a coating that goes on before any of the secondary lubrication that's a rust inhibitor. So it's just being thoroughly cleaned, thoroughly lubricated. And one of the important parts there is we're on the inside and we're doing that proactive inspection. I might find a little tiny hairline crack in the head of the stock that can be fixed and arrested permanently, and it's not a problem. Where, if you waited a year or two, maybe the stock is significantly damaged. So there's that maintenance, lubrication, and then that proactive making sure everything's okay. And, I tell people, and I hate to use numbers of days in the field because it
Right.
varies a lot with cover types, but, if you're an average hunter that's out there 20, 25 days a year, and the gun hasn't had what I would call an incident, every 3 to 4 years is probably good with that. Now, if you're somebody that's out there, if you're a professional guide or somebody that's out there 50, 60 days a year in a lot of different conditions, maybe every 2 years. And then there's when I say an incident, so like if you get caught, if the gun gets significantly wet, or you drop it in the mud and get a whole bunch of grit and stuff inside the action or
Okay.
something like that, there's, that would prompt that thorough cleaning right off the bat. And again, some different forms of hunting, have different levels of when you want to do that. So grouse hunters specifically need to do it more frequently because you're in the jungle and grouse guns get just full of stuff. You'd be
Yeah.
shocked at the stuff that I've pulled out of guns, pine needles and fern fronds and feathers and, all sorts of stuff. And then, the other thing is, and again, I've said this a bunch of times, but if the other avenue that's really hard on guns is anytime you're doing field waterfowl hunting, in coffin blinds or pit blinds, that you're just down in the dirt, and I find those guns get really, need that maintenance a lot more often. So
Is there anything else, like, obviously, a drop in the mud, as an incident as you're referring to, that would be something that might trigger it for the user gun owner. Anything else, like, it's kind of nuanced, right? Like, okay, the gun closes and the trigger pulls and it goes off. It's fine, right? But what else might you be looking for if you're breaking the gun open, you're feeling something there. If you feel sand or grit, obviously that would be a trigger. If things are loose, do you do anything with the forend, checking the barrels, that kind of stuff? Maybe we got a vintage gun. What else are you looking for?
again, just run it through the function test, with snap caps, check the trigger pull. And I mean, I obviously have gauges, but if all of a sudden you feel like the front trigger got significantly lighter or significantly heavier, little changes like that, we all kind of learn how our guns feel when we're using them. If you start opening and closing it and it's functioning, but there's some type of, if the gun's clean, but yet there's some type of, hitch in the giddy up or a gritty
Right.
feeling or something like that, that's something you'd want to do, have checked out right away. And again, if there's, a traumatic event, like you drop the gun, or, something happens where something falls on it or it falls down, and, that's when you'd want to have the wood inspected to make sure there isn't some damage internally there. So,
How about guns with oil finish stocks? What are we doing for maintenance there? The bird hunter that knows, basically nothing about guns, can I touch up the oil finish on my gun? And if so, how do I do it?
there's kind of two different avenues with that. When you're saying touch up the finish, as far as like actually putting finish on the stock, as in like an oil finish on the stock, if you're competent enough to do that, you can wipe a light coat on and let it dry. Now again, results may vary, understand your own
Yeah,
level of
yeah.
competence, but as far as just general, what an average person would do maintenance wise is, of course I have some stuff that I mix up in the shop, but there's, I like Howard's Feed and Wax is a good product. They also make a natural paste wax, and those are really good for oil finishes. They nourish the finish. They don't dry or adhere to it. And that's something that you would do, every other time you take it out, have a rag with some of that Howard's on it and just wipe the stock down lightly, let it sit on there for a minute and then wipe it off. That's a really good product.
What's the difference between oil and wax?
Well, so an oil would be, like the oils that we would use on the stocks are going to be things like, they would call it like lem oil or a citrus oil. It can be natural oil finish, the same oils that are in a finish, but there's no hardener in it. So they're not going to dry onto the stock. Whereas, and then the waxes typically have, and it's kind of like the difference between a lipid and a fat and a solid fat, right? The waxes are typically going to be in a solid state at room temperature, and those are going to be things like beeswax and carnauba or carnauba wax and those type of things, and those are good. Again, you want to make sure that when you're using those waxes, you're getting one that has that's I use the term all natural, that doesn't have, because you can get some waxes that have thinners and waxes that are actually designed to be built up, right? Some furniture waxes are, again, much like a finish, where you're laying down that layer of that solid material and then polishing it and putting down another layer. And we don't really want those on those oil finishes, because you'll build that layer of wax up to a certain point and then it's hardened, and when it de-adheres, sometimes it'll take a little bit of the actual stock finish with it. So, again, that Howard's paste wax is one that I use pretty routinely. I don't make my own wax polishes in the shop. Again, I have my own kind of formula that I use in the shop as far as the liquid, essentially stock conditioner. But the closest analog to that you're going to get, in the open market is that Howard's Feed and Wax. So,
Secret concoction.
mm-hmm. Yep.
It's funny, man, because I have never been a woodworker, and in fact, I'm kind of curious about it, because I don't know, it just sounds appealing to me. Sort of slow, whether it's gun stocks or anything. I could see myself getting into that, but it's one of those things where it very quickly turns into like, whoa, this is way out of my league. And I'm just wondering, like, do you do more harm than good by, you hear people say, put a drop of oil on your stock and rub it in and just, gradually condition it over time. I mean, is that something we should be thinking about? Can we do it successfully and not ruin the stock? I mean, how should we think about that?
Well, I don't know. And again, that's where I say, like, you know, if you're actually putting, finish on, wood finish on the stock, so that's going to be, linseed oil or tung oil or any of those type of things. Again, yes, you can do exactly what you're talking about. And if you're competent, it can have a benefit. And yeah, that's not a bad idea. But again, I'm always reticent to tell people to do that sort of thing, because if you get that wrong, you can mess up your finish pretty well. Whereas with the conditioners like the Howard's Feed and Wax, that's something that you really can't overdo, right? You're not, it's going to nourish the finish. It's going to maintain it. But there's a little bit higher threshold for harming anything with that stuff. And I'm a devotee of the various types of oil finishes because they're easy to maintain. You can go back and essentially refinishing or touching up a finish professionally is a lot easier to do with those type of finishes. And, again, if you use those conditioning products, those oil finishes will stay looking really good for a long, long time. And we've all seen it. If you don't, the oil finishes, guess what? A tung oil finish is not as durable as an epoxy or a polyurethane finish, but
Right.
the benefits are you can maintain it. And again, if properly maintained, those oil finishes will stay good, looking good for a long, long time. And again, we've seen the stock that doesn't have that done, and they get that kind of dried out look, almost like kind of they'll be a little opaque, and that's where the stock has gotten wet or been abraded, and it hasn't been reconditioned. So, but again, the amount of time it actually takes to do that is, you can wipe a coat of that Howard's on and off in 2 minutes, after you come out of the field or after you shoot. So
Yeah. And what would be like a good prescription there? Like, could you do it after every time you hunted, or would you not want to do that? You could.
yeah, absolutely. Every time. I mean, I kind of have, we've talked about this in the past, but a little ritual where it's like, I'll, typically I don't do it between hunts, but if it's been wet or it's at the end of the day, I'll bring the stock in, let the gun get warmed up and dried out, and then kind of cursorily wipe it off, so I've got all the grit out of the checkering and, off of the stock, and then I'll put a coat of that, a light coat of that Howard's on, wipe it all back off. I've got a little, kid's soft bristle toothbrush in my, kit bag. I brush out the checkering, have a quick look at everything else, put the lube on the proper spots, and it's ready for the next morning.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds very approachable to somebody like me. So put that all over the stock and forend, not in the checkering. Where are we applying it?
Yeah, you don't want to, you want to avoid getting pretty much anything in the checkering if you can.
Right.
But if you have again, that stuff doesn't dry. It doesn't really harden.
You don't have to be super concerned about going next to the edge of the checkering.
Nope. You get a little in the checkering, that's just fine. And then, it sits there for a little while. Again, you wipe as much of it off as you can. And then that's where you go back. And if you do have a little bit of it in there, that's when you brush out the, I'm using that little kid's toothbrush. Yeah. And I say kid's toothbrush because those have the, the soft bristles. And I'm brushing that out. And again, it's if you brush your checkering out, which again, to brush the checkering out on a standard forearm and buttstock, you're looking at about 45 to 50 seconds. It's not a big time investment. And if you do that, over time, your checkering's not going to fill up with garbage and, just stay looking good and stay feeling sharp. So
I have always had a toothbrush, that soft bristle toothbrush in my little kit ever since wherever the first time I heard you mention it, just because I find it handy for that. And then also, I've got 2 of them in there because I use one for cleaning around the extractors and stuff, which I know you're always a proponent of. You got to watch that, anything that's kind of moving in and out, check those areas. I'll run a little cloth or a toothbrush through there and just kind of get all that little grit out of there. And I find that to be really effective just for pushing stuff out of there. So
The other secret weapon for that too to have in your bag is a little can of compressed air. Like the keyboard cleaners, the compressed air. That is so handy when you get stuff, in areas you can't really get to with a Q-tip or a brush, or under your ejectors, just blowing that out. And I've always got one of those.
Do you have one of those electric air dusters now that they call them?
Oh,
Have you seen those?
I have a DeWalt cordless air compressor that's in my truck
Oh, okay.
24/7 that, it can either be a compressor or a blower, but yeah, any of those things like that are handy.
Guest, George DaCosta, he was on, I think in the last year, he brought that up to me, and I bought one of those little air dusters off Amazon, and I have, as he was describing on that episode, there's countless uses for those. I'm opened up all my windows this spring and blew everything out of there, some leaves and stuff, but I have it. It's small. It goes with me wherever I go. If you need a blast of air, those things are really, really nice. Rechargeable USB-C, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's a good idea. I haven't really used it on my guns yet, but I probably will this fall. So yeah. Is that Howard's Feed Wax? Menards stores. I'm assuming you can order it. There will definitely be a link to that in the show notes.
You can get it right off. Get it right off Amazon. Most hardware stores are going to have it. Pretty much every furniture store will probably have it. I've seen it at all the box stores. So yeah, it's not a difficult product to get.
Cool. We'll be dropping that one in the show notes for sure. Let's see. Well, okay, let's talk about the leather butt pad thing briefly, and then I got a few questions on ammo and stuff before we wrap up. But I had my old French gun, the Guillot, send it over to you for we were actually going to you were going to re-oil the stock, and then the recoil pad was basically shot. So you put a leather butt pad on it for me, and you had to do a little bit of engineering to design and develop that.
Yeah, and it was there. I hate to say yours was the prototype.
The guinea pig?
It wasn't really, because I'd experimented with it in the past. Yours was the first one that I actually did after all the development. But with a leather covered pad, you're taking a rubber recoil pad with a base plate and grinding it down, and then grinding the relief and stretching the leather over the top of it, and then doing all the other processes. And there were a couple of very specific pads that I used, and like a lot of things, the quality of the consistency of the quality of those pads just really got bad over the past 4 or 5 years. And I don't know if they changed the manufacturing, where it was manufactured or how it was manufactured. And then too, one of the companies stopped making several of the sizes that I use very regularly. And I just kind of got tired of dealing with that, because, if I'm doing a regular recoil pad and I grind into a void because of a casting imperfection in the rubber, it's one thing. But if I've got 4 hours into a leather recoil pad and I'm in the end stages and I go to stretch the leather and all of a sudden the base plate cracks or something like that, I've lost a lot of time and effort. So I just kind of theorized about, because it gets covered, just making my own essentially base recoil pad. So I bought a inexpensive duometer, which is basically like a little, kind of similar to a Rockwell hardness tester, but it operates on a scale for rubber. And I took the two recoil pads that I like to use, and one was a little harder than the other one. So, I'm just throwing out numbers here. As I remember, one of them was like 50 and one of them was 60 and one of them was 40. So I went out and sourced some, good quality neoprene sheet rubber that was at 50, right in between the two hardnesses that I liked, in various thicknesses. And then got some canvas micarta to use as the base plate, and essentially just glued those two things together and made the base plate. And it's a little bit more labor intensive on the front end, but the benefits of doing that are pretty good. I know the consistency. I've got the hardness I want. The base plate is stiffer, so I can stretch the leather a lot easier. And the other thing, interestingly, that it allows me to do is to control the hole spacing, right? Because a lot of times you're working with pre-existing holes. There might be lightning holes in the butt, and with the factory produced pads, those holes are where they are, and you've got to set the adjustment up and down. And of course, on the top, you're stretching into a radius, so you don't want the plug very close to the heel and all that. And with, with the way I did yours, I'm able to just decide where I want the holes, and I can drill them any place I want. And I was really happy with the way that one turned out. And actually, it was kind of a hardcore acid test, because anytime you get over an inch, stretching the leather gets kind of dicey, because on a good pad you can't have pleats. It should look like the leather is just grown out of the pad, right? And the thicker the pad is, the harder it is to stretch the leather and get all those pleats out. And yours, again, I think yours was about 1.3 inches. It's like 1.3 or something. So it was on the edge of, really kind of on the edge of what I could do with the old ones, using the factory pads. And with that new, shop made base pad, I was able to stretch that really, really well.
Is that leather, is that glued to the pad at all, or is it just simply stretched over the underneath?
It's glued on. Once you
Okay.
grind the relief on the pad, drill the holes, and then of course you radius the pad, it goes on the pad is screwed to a form, basically a piece of wood that's the profile of the pad. And then
Okay.
the leather is wetted and stretched on. There's pictures on my Instagram, my Upland Gunsmith Instagram feed, of doing leather pads, and
Okay.
the leather stretched. It's then tacked down. Then I use surgical tubing or cord to pull the leather down, and then it gets dried. You let it dry out, and you may wet it and dry it several times to get it to stretch. Then you take the pins out, you take the rubber off, and you cut the leather off around the form, and you essentially peel the leather off of the pad, take the form off, put glue inside, on the interior of the leather, and then slip the pad back in. So it is glued on permanently. And then you've got to go back through and cut the holes for the plugs, and cut the leather as it's folded over the back is pleated too. So there's little relief cuts on the back, and then those little tabs are folded over. So it's leather pads are great. I love leather pads. There really isn't anything quite like a leather pad, but they are very labor intensive. So
They're really, because again, I didn't set out to have one put on my gun, but when you got into taking the old one off, you're just like, this thing's kind of, done. So I knew you did those, and it's a nice gun. So I was like, well, let's try one of the, let's have a little fun, put a leather pad on. But they're pretty much like, it's an aesthetic thing, right? They look awesome. They're obviously functional enough, but I guess why, if anything, would somebody consider it? Just, you got a nice gun and you want a real nice leather pad on there?
there's the aesthetic side of it, which again, there's really isn't a whole lot other than maybe an ebony butt plate or something like that looks that stylish. But there is something about leather, and I think you'll probably find this when you shoot your gun, as far as coming up out of the pocket clean. That leather, just, it's like a wood butt plate. It doesn't hang up on anything, and it slips by. But then, because it's leather, it's got it's skin, right? It's got that kind of a texture to it. And then when you just apply a little bit of pressure, it's very stable in the pocket. So it's kind of that best of both worlds, where it's a little bit grabby, it stays put, but it doesn't hang up on anything, like a synthetic pad sometimes can.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, I wasn't sure what else that entailed other than they just look freaking cool, especially on
Yeah,
a,
if you haven't shot that gun yet, I'll be interested to see what you think of it, because it is I think you will notice it when you shoot it, that
yeah,
it's a very fluid movement coming up and in.
yeah, yeah. That was we've done a few things to that gun. I bought it, it's a kind of a good full circle thing. I maybe talked about it a little bit on the show before, but I consulted you when I bought it because I knew the dimensions were, and I had done my fitting with you and kind of recognized that it was within the ranges. Those things that if folks have heard you on a podcast before, or they do a gun fitting, you always talk to people about this, what you will be able to do after that gun fitting is complete. We kind of looked at that gun and said, we can probably do this and that to it to get it within the tolerance that you need to be. And long story short, we did that, and I shoot it well. I'm happy about that. And then you bent it, and that to get the fit right. And then we did the oil, and now we've done the pad, and that's about it. But I'm looking forward to shooting that this fall.
Yeah, those Gios are neat guns.
Yeah.
I like those a lot.
Yep. I know you've had a few of them come through the shop. They're not super common, but that kind of added. I just stumbled upon it in my local gun shop down at Puglisi's and was doing some digging, and I consulted you and Greg Elliott, and it it found its way home with me. Okay, ammo. I'm just kind of, we could obviously talk patterning and that kind of stuff we had before, but have you done a lot with blended loads? Because I feel like it's maybe coming out of the turkey side of things, the TSS, the 9s and the 10s and the stacked, the blends and stuff, and we're seeing that more and more. Do you experiment with that at all? And if so, what has been your experience with it?
I've peripherally tested a few blended loads, and again, it's everybody needs to do their own pattern testing because, as I've talked about before, every gun has its own personality as far as what it doesn't like and reacts to certain type of ammo. But the blended loads, I've not really ever had. I don't want to say they're bad, but I've not seen any benefit to them. Let's put it like that.
Like a significant benefit, like
No,
I need to be shooting this blended load.
no, and I think that, again, we can get down in the weeds with it, but the theoretical benefit of those blended loads sounds good, but in actual application, if you're using a single shot size with the right choke and the right load, and it's got the right density and the right distribution, I can't see a real benefit to it. I think a lot of times there's an economy factor, because some of the non-tox alloys are so expensive where you get a little bit of the benefit, but it's got half of that material, that really expensive material in the shot column. I have done some pretty extensive, testing with loads that have different shot sizes. And again, there too, I've never really saw anything that made me think that would be a good idea to do, at least, as far as my experience goes. I will say the one time that I used a blended load that I liked was, it was a federal load. It was a turkey load, and this was turkey hunting, right? And it was the load that had, a heavy polymer in it. And I shouldn't say polymer. I believe it was federal heavyweight. Might have been TSS. I can't remember, but it had some of those flight stopper pellets, those copper plated pellets that have the little ring around them. And what that did was those flight stopper pellets opened up significantly. So you kind of had a core with this little fringe of those flight stopper pellets. And, I specifically use those because I was hunting in a really interesting setup where I would potentially maybe have a shot at 40 yards, but sometimes the birds were working and they'd come through the woods and I wasn't going to see them till they were about 15 yards away. And that's actually, I can say there it benefited me because what I just described happened is I had some birds out working in a field, and then all of a sudden the tom I was looking for, he just appeared, 15 yards away. I had my gun up, so I didn't need to move a whole lot. I was in a in a ground blind, and I shot, and he dropped like a stone, and I walked up there and I couldn't see where I'd hit him, and when I went back and cleaned the bird, I found, he'd been hit twice at 15 yards, and just a little bit of that fringe came out, and there was one of those flight stopper pellets that had actually was lodged in one of the vertebrae and one that had passed through. And because with that, I was using a turkey choke at 15 yards. Your pattern's smaller than a baseball, right? It's I don't feel bad about saying I almost missed that bird because it was close. But yeah, but again, I don't want to make generalizations. I'm just telling people my experience because you might find that with your specific gun, some of those blended or duplex loads work very well. Then you just got to go find out for yourself. So,
Yeah, I was just kind of curious if you had any experience with it. The economy one does make sense. I've seen, it's one of these things where I feel it would be, and really, I feel like we're seeing this because I'm seeing the magazine that it's easy for the marketing machine to kind of grab on and be like, oh, now we've got a stacked, duplex load. It's something to talk about. So I get that. But the economy thing, TSS is very expensive. And so in that some of these loads I've seen, you got some TSS and some steel to kind of fill that out, maybe make it a more economical shell. It's non-toxic. I understand all that. That makes sense. What about like, okay, say like a lead, lead 7 and 9. What does I guess my thought would be, if a 9 is good enough, based on our conversations in the past, you know, in theory, the 7 is in there to give you a little bit more power, I guess, energy delivery. But like we've talked about before, you fill that pattern out with more smaller pellets, and you put 10 more pellets on the bird. How much energy are we actually delivering? So that maybe I've got the Del Whitman bias, but that's how I would think about it.
You just said it for me. Do you want to hit the bird twice with a 6, or do you want to hit it 5 or 6 times with a 7.5 or an 8, and again, 9s might be a little small. I don't personally use 9s in the field, but I use a lot of 8.5s, and I'm 8.5 is more than applicable. And of course, we're talking about things like grouse and woodcock and quail here.
Correct.
But again, the idea is, when I talk about the 3 Ds, density, distribution, and diameter. And, the theory is you want that pattern to be as big as it can, because the bigger the pattern, the more likely you are to hit the bird. And if your pattern's 25% bigger, you got 25% more margin for error. But the limiting factor there is you've got to have lethal density, right? You've got to put the right number of pellets on the bird. And that's where, doing the testing and finding a pattern that is very uniform from the center out to the edge is very important, because if you've got a center dense pattern, you're essentially losing efficiency, because you've got a higher density than you need in the center of the pattern, and there's less density as you go out. So in order to maintain the lethal pellet count on the bird at those outside edges, if you've got a center dense pattern, you got to reduce your pattern size to maintain that lethal density all the way out to the edge of the pattern. So a uniform pattern can maintain the lethal density at a wider diameter. I hope that made sense how I laid that down. And that's where, again, this is just what I have personally found, a lot of those duplex loads, and multi-shot loads, I find the patterns to be kind of inconsistent. You're not having a good uniform distribution. And again, they tend to be, a lot of times, again, those heavier pellets will divert less, and they tend to be kind of in the core, right? Where a lot of the smaller pellets will kind of fill out the outside. Now, I'd rather use that available payload to just throw more of the same size pellet and make sure that the load I'm using is uniform, so I can have it be as big as I want it to be. So
the other thing I thought of, and maybe it's insignificant, but given your knowledge of patterning and physics, do we have any sort of a time difference as far as like, do the heavier pellets travel slower, faster, delivering on target? Would there be any kind of separation there in the shot stringing effect, or is it effectively irrelevant?
It's, as far as when it gets there is irrelevant. And the whole shot string thing, you've probably heard me go on my little tirade about that, but shot string in the field, unless, other than a very few specific instances, shot string just does not really have an applicable effect. By the amount of time that it takes from the front end of the pattern and the back end of the pattern to get on target, if you actually look at how long that takes and how fast a bird moves, it's irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
It just, I think I did that equation once, and I can't remember what all the parameters were, but I figured the bird was going to move in and out of the pattern like an inch and an eighth or something. It's very minimal.
I know you walked me through that out one time, and it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, but
I wonder if you're getting calls and stuff. Vintage guns, obviously, that's a lot of guns that come through your shop are vintage guns. Low pressure, availability. What are you seeing is RST? How are they producing? Again, not that you would know, but I'm assuming you get a lot of questions on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, RST is producing, it is available. You've just got to stay on top of it. There's been a couple other, I believe, was it B&P?
B&P came, I sent you we were texting about that a little bit. I haven't had any of it, but
Yeah, they came out with a low pressure load. Component availability for reloading is better. Shot's pretty readily available. Primers are available. As we talked about before, I'm not seeing any shortages of bismuth on the consumer level for reloading. I don't know about, manufacturer
Yep.
volume type bismuth production. But there's, kind of getting down in the weeds with reloading, there's a couple of the companies have kind of done some change ups where they've phased out kind of some of the legacy powders and brought out some comparable but different powders. Hodgdon's done that, a lot lately. So we're kind of, there's powders that fit a certain profile that are available, but they're not the same powder that I was using, pre-COVID or even, a couple years ago. So,
All right. Let's wrap up with, we'll mention the gun fitting again. So availability in August. I'll have either a link or your contact info in the show notes. People can just reach out to you to schedule that.
yep.
August at Pineridge Grouse Camp. And I think that's it, man. You making plans for the fall? Or you getting excited at this point? I know you are, but
Working with my new pointer as much as I can, getting her ready. October, I'm kind of just, I don't really have a lot of plans right now for October other than, hunting my local covers here. And last year I didn't get to do, I'm pretty close to the Eastern UP and the Central UP. And historically I've done a lot of kind of like quick, 2.5 day, 3-day weekends, up there. And I'd like to do more of that this year too. So then maybe go over and see you and Jeremy in Wisconsin.
sounds a lot like my fall. Got the early trip in, and then we'll let grouse season unfold and see where that takes us, and who knows what we'll come up with after that.
What's the bird report over there in Minnesota?
So drumming counts came out in Wisconsin, which I have not thoroughly read through. I was talking to my county forester buddy Mike, was on the podcast. It was like 8% down in the northern part of the state, which is relatively stable. It's not a huge change. Drumming counts, winter survival. It's not the hatch. I feel like it was such a mixed bag of weather this fall. We had a little bit, not this fall, this spring, a little bit of everything. We had some rains. We had maybe a day or two of some cooler weather. Nothing maybe torrential. Some areas got hit hard. It's like every year, right? Like it's just, what is the hatch going to look like in your favorite areas? Who knows? But I don't know. People are seeing birds out on the roads. I haven't seen any brood surveys or anything like that, but I would say it's a sort of a quiet level of optimism right now. But I think that's maybe sort of like every year. We're all cautiously optimistic.
This is the one, right?
Yeah.
And I think Minnesota was this way too, where we had quite a bit of rain in May and June, but we didn't have any of that rain that was, rain coupled with an extended cold snap after it. So hopefully that helps more than it hurts if it's warm rain and not cold rain. So
yep. Time will tell. I was talking to somebody, a guy out of South Dakota, actually. You did a gun fitting for him, Eric. He, they see the birds on the roads this time of year. They're seeing the pheasant chicks and everything. It's just with grouse, you just don't see as much, I feel like, this time of year. So it's harder to predict, but
yeah, I've been watching the rainfall in North Dakota like a farmer. Yeah. And they're actually,
they got some recently, I think, right?
Yeah. Year to date in the areas that, in that kind of area where we typically hunt, I think they're very slightly above average, which is good because for the past few years, they've been quite a bit below average. So yeah, that could be good.
Yeah. It's about that time to start making some phone calls to friends and family members and see how things are looking, because that builds the enthusiasm a little bit. If you're going hunting tomorrow, what's your favorite upland gun right now? And don't be afraid to say what it really is.
Well, I can't say one, but this is like, what's your favorite cigar? What's your favorite bourbon? If I'm just grabbing something generally, it's probably going to be one of two guns, and that's going to be my Upland Gun Company Venus, which is a lightweight 12 that I can, it weighs what a 20 gauge does. So depending on my load, I can shoot 28 gauge loads out of it all the way up to a fairly significant field load. I have, as this is a secret between you and me, Nick, but I do have a lightweight auto loader that I use that's, essentially the exact same weight, balance, and fit as my Upland Gun Company gun, but it's what I take out when it's nasty. If it's really wet, really rainy, if I'm going to be in the mud, the blood, and the beer, I'll take that out. So those are kind of the same gun, just in a permutation. And then, if it's grouse and woodcock, I'm taking my, 5-pound 28 gauge over and under. I've got a little Rizzini BR110, and that's my grouse gun. Then my other one that's typically in my batteries, I've got that same gun in a 410, and that's for when the woodcock flights come in. So I may only use that gun 3 days a year, or a week a year, but when the heavy woodcock flights come in, that little 410 is just a lot of fun. So,
do you have like a vintage gun that is kind of your not a safe queen, but like, do you have a favorite vintage gun?
Yeah, and me, Nick, right? So I always have a couple that are in the shop that I'm working on, that I clean up, that I shoot. It's the one time where I'm kind of a horse trader on that, whereas I've had relatively the same guns that I shoot, my workhorse guns, for years. But I've one of them that I'm working on is I've got my dad's Remington 1894, which is a very nice side by side, basically a perfect copy of an Anson and Dealey box lock, and I'm working with that one. I've got a Webley and Scott that I fool around with a little bit. As crazy as it sounds, I've toyed with the idea of building, stocking and using an Ithaca Model 37.
Oh yeah,
that's
the little lightweight pump gun, right?
Yeah, it's a bottom eject pump gun, and they all had takeoff barrels. And although I work on a lot of continental European and British stuff, I do kind of have a fascination with some specific Americana guns, and that's one of them. Those 37s. I love Winchester lever action rifles too. So for what little hunting I do with rifles anymore, I like to use those. But yeah, it's, and out of all of them, I would say, that Venus is just kind of, I built that gun to be that kind of jack of all trades, where it carries like a 20. I can shoot it like a 28, or I can shoot it like a full power 12 I want. So there isn't much that I can't just pull that out of the gun drawer with, and with the right ammunition, do whatever I need to do. So
Dale Whitman, your interests, your tastes, and your experience is very wide ranging, and that's why we love having you on the Birdshot Podcast. I appreciate it, buddy.
I appreciate it. I appreciate being here.
All right, buddy. We'll see you soon, and check the show notes for some of the stuff that Dale mentioned and those August gun fittings. And thanks again, Dale. We'll see you this fall.
You bet.
All right. Hey everyone, it's your host Nick here. One more thing before you go. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Birdshot Podcast presented by Onyx Hunt. Be sure to subscribe and follow the show so you don't miss our next episode. And if you really love the show and want to contribute above and beyond what you already do by listening, you can do so by joining our Patreon community. Click the link in the show notes to this episode. You can sign up for as little as $5 a month. And if you do, I will send you some of these Birdshot Podcast can coolers and stickers as a thank you for doing so. Thanks, everyone. Catch you on the next episode of the Birdshot Podcast.